Challenger, go with throttle up.
The Space Shuttle Challenger is destroyed just a little more than 1 minute after liftoff.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical
All
miles.
7 astronauts on board are killed.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Tonight, reporting from Washington.
It is the worst disaster in the history of the American space program, and President Reagan has declared a week of mourning for the 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, who lost their lives on their way into space this morning. Now, we know that many of you have heard the news many hours ago and may even have seen some of our extended coverage this afternoon. But many others of you, we surmise, have been at work, and thus we're going to spend virtually our entire broadcast this evening on what is not only a crushingly sad day for families, friends, and colleagues of the astronauts, but also an enormous shock to the manned space program, which before today had gone so well. Never before have American lives been lost in flight. We will try to answer many of your questions, but as of this evening, many questions remain unanswered. We begin at Cape Canaveral with ABC's John Quinones.
They gathered for what turned out to be their last meal at 6:48 this morning, the ceremonial breakfast. For months, they had trained together. Astronaut Ellison Onizuka from Hawaii, the star of this mission, New Hampshire schoolteacher Christa McAuliffe, mission commander Dick Scobee, pilot Michael Smith, astronauts Judith Resnik and Ronald McNair, and payload specialist Gregory B.Jarvis. After 3 days of delays, they appeared tired, but quickly rejuvenated by applause as they headed for the launch pad.
Scobee, followed by mission specialist Judith Resnik, Ron McNair, and pilot Mike Smith, followed by Christa McAuliffe, teacher in space, Ellison Onizuka, and payload specialist Greg Jarvis.
Final preparations before liftoff. The ground crew gives McAuliffe an apple for the teacher, and wishes of good luck. Initially, liftoff was scheduled for 9:38 this morning, but again there were problems. A hard freeze overnight left ice on the launch pad, a 2-hour delay, and then NASA discovers a faulty fire detector on board the shuttle, another hour's delay while it's replaced. Finally, the liftoff was set for 11:38. A crowd of some 500 spectators, including 18 visiting school children from McAuliffe's hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, waited anxiously and then counted down. The liftoff appeared flawless. The spectators, including Christa McAuliffe's parents, Grace and Edward Corrigan, watched proudly through tears of joy. 65 seconds into flight, NASA Control orders Commander Scobee to go to full power.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up.
Suddenly, an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
NASA loses all communication with Challenger, but the crowd still does not realize that something's gone wrong. Within seconds, Challenger disintegrates.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
For the spectators and Christa McAuliffe's parents, joy turns to confusion, worry, and a realization of tragedy. The $1.2 billion spaceship, its 7 crew members, and their satellite payload disappear.
I thought the flight was going fine. And then I heard them say major malfunction. And then the person beside me said it's exploded. And it was... I couldn't speak. It was...
Within minutes, emergency rescue teams parachuted in, converging on a search area 18 miles east of Cape Canaveral.
Debris continued to fall for 50 minutes and more, and obviously you can't send aircraft and ships into an area where debris is falling, where they themselves may be endangered.
Late this afternoon, after 6 hours of searching, NASA reports they found no survivors.
These searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
Tonight, NASA and Cape Canaveral are in mourning. Tonight at Cape Canaveral, Vice President George Bush, accompanied by Senators Jake Garn and John Glenn, both former astronauts, expressed the nation's condolences to the families of the astronauts. Bush had a special message for American school children.
You must try to understand that spirit, bravery, and commitment are what make not only the space program, but all of life worthwhile. We must never, as people in our daily lives or as a nation, stop exploring, stop hoping, stop discovering. We must press on.
John Quinones, ABC News, Cape Canaveral.
This whole concept of a teacher in space has been important to the country, but especially to the children, as the Vice President alluded ever since President Reagan in 1984 suggested there be a teacher in space. It was going to be a very big day in Christa McAuliffe's hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, and especially at the high school where she taught. ABC's Jay Shadler was there.
Christa McAuliffe's students and friends at Concord High School were ready to watch a dream come true this morning. Instead, they became witnesses to a nightmare.
2, 1, and liftoff.
In the moments after the launch, their celebrations drowned out the first news of the tragedy. But the clamor turned to quiet as this picture burned itself into their memories.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water.
Some people were covering their eyes, and some people were just watching the TV set with a blank look on their face.
It was really quite dramatic. At first, you know, everyone was really happy, all these smiles, and then suddenly you saw a lot of people crying in the halls, and it was really pretty sad.
Just moments before, Eileen O'Hara, Christa McAuliffe's good friend and classroom substitute, had shared this haunting sentiment with a local reporter.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to watch because I want her to be safe and I want her to have fun.
Now the public celebration had turned into private mourning and shock.
She was a part of us. She was part of a family. And it's like, if your sister or brother died, she'll be remembered. It was the hell. It's the hell.
Though Christa McAuliffe's students and friends have known her here in Concord for years, she became known to the nation when she decided to pursue her dreams. Those dreams have been sparked by President Reagan's announcement a year ago for a teacher astronaut. The search for that history maker brought 11,000 applications, but only one made the final grade.
And the winner, the teacher who will be going into space, Christa McAuliffe.
From the outset, she approached this mission and her training with the same ideals she brought to the classroom.
Well, it was a challenge, and it was something that I always ask my students, you know, to go and seek whatever they feel they can do and reach a little higher.
She wore her spirit on her face, and her hometown loved it.
Difficult to say.
Now they are remembering it. A special counselor will be brought to Concord High tomorrow to help students begin dealing with their loss. But perhaps Christa McAuliffe's own words echo the best advice.
To follow your instincts and go for your dreams, and I hope they achieve that.
Jay Shadler, ABC News, Concord, New Hampshire.
When Challenger was 10 miles up and 18 miles downrange and that explosion occurred, we all knew a great deal about Christa McAuliffe, but we've become so accustomed to the shuttle going up and coming down now that the other astronauts on board were just not as well known to us. Well, they are today, and ABC's Stone Phillips has been looking at them.
When they posed, it was like a portrait of America. Men and women, war veterans and first-time astronauts, parents, and even a classical pianist. Their commander was Francis Scobee, age 46, from Washington State, an astronaut after 22 years in the Air Force. This was his second shuttle mission. Second in command, pilot Michael Smith, age 40, a decorated Navy pilot from North Carolina. Like Scobee, he'd seen combat in Vietnam and trained as a test pilot. And like the commander, he was a husband and father. This was Smith's first shuttle mission. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka was the first Hawaiian astronaut who believed in the benefits of the space program.
There are a lot of outcomes from these projects which will affect both our society and the rest of the world.
Onizuka is survived by his wife and 2 daughters. 36-year-old mission specialist Judy Resnik was a shuttle veteran, her assignment to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm. She was on board the shuttle Discovery in 1984 when a launch was aborted after the engines had fired. Gregory B.Jarvis was on board to conduct tests on the effects of weightlessness on liquids carried in tanks. Born in Detroit, trained as an Air Force satellite engineer, Jarvis was on his first shuttle mission. Ronald McNair, age 36, from South Carolina, brought a background in physics and laser technology to the shuttle program. This was the second trip to space for a husband and father who saw space travel as a calling for mankind.
I see it as something that we must do, and I see it as something that's part of man's nature to explore.
These six, along with Christa McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, now a tragic page in NASA history. Stone Phillips, ABC News.
When we come back, we'll try to analyze what happened. It isn't easy. Throughout the many hours today before NASA officials came out at Cape Canaveral and made an official statement, there was an incredible anxiety that many people in the nation seemed to feel about getting an answer to what had really happened. Well, the real answer may be a very long time in coming, but ABC's Lynn Scher, who covers space for us on a regular basis and has for a long time, is with us tonight in our Los Angeles bureau. Lynn?
Well, Peter, all the NASA experts, those review boards, are certainly going to check all the data they can gather, and they are going to be looking at all the pictures they can see. And those are the exact same pictures that we have been looking at also, and we've been taking a closer look at those last tragic moments. Here you see what they call a nominal ascent. All those words, textbook, picture perfect, and then suddenly a tiny flame just where the fuel lines go from the big external tank into Challenger itself. On the left, with the arrow, a plume where gases from the tank are forming, obviously feeding the fire. Now you will see the flame creeping up the external tank in between the tank and the shuttle itself. This is the beginning of the huge, catastrophic explosion that absolutely engulfed the entire system. You will see a second explosion right at the top of that big external tank. This is obviously what put the entire thing into flames and probably what destroyed the shuttle almost instantly. Now for a moment the smoke clears and we see emerging apparently the top of Challenger. We think this is the last picture we have ever seen of Challenger before it fell to the sea with its precious cargo. And as the sequence is going to continue, you will see that mammoth, horrible explosion on the right. One of the solid rocket boosters split away now from the tank and the shuttle itself. These boosters cannot be controlled once they're lit, so it has obviously gone off on its own into the wrong place, but it does not appear, I repeat, appear from what we can see that it was the cause of the explosion or that anything happened to it. So that's the sequence. We can see that. We can try to understand it. What we don't know is why it happened, and that's what we now need to find out. Peter?
Lynn, thank you very much. Joining us tonight from Houston is the former astronaut Gene Cernan from the Apollo program, and he also has seen this same sequence repeated many times throughout the day. Gene, I know your reluctance to speculate and share it with you, but do you see anything in those pictures which give us a clue?
I think the analysis Lynn presented, the only one we have to work with because, you know, we don't have access to the data, and it would take even us, if we had the time, weeks and weeks to analyze it. But just simply from the pictures, it sounded to me like her analysis, as it was portrayed, has got some substance to it. We can't answer why. We don't know why. We don't know why it might have happened, but from those pictures we might very well be able to see what happened. Remember that tank that she referred to is carrying thousands and thousands of pounds of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Hydrogen is a propellant. It burns, it explodes. Liquid oxygen is the oxidizer, like air, which supports the fire, which allows it to burn. And if you burn it as a controlled substance, if you meter it and you burn them together properly like you do in the engines, it's an ally. But when you allow them to join in an uncontrolled atmosphere, what can happen did happen.
Gene, very quickly, I'm afraid, but can you tell us why there was no escape mechanism on board today?
Well, the shuttle was designed early with ejection seats, so that if something occurred, the crew on its first 3 or 4 flights could get out. It was a test program. The evolution of the shuttle under an operational vehicle took those seats out. The only escape mechanism, as it was planned, was that the shuttle itself, with an impending problem, one you could see coming, could get off those tanks, turn around, and land back at Kennedy Space Center. Obviously, they did not have time for that because they didn't know the catastrophe was occurring.
Gene Cernan, thank you very much from Houston, and Lynn Scher from Los Angeles. When we come back, we'll have the reaction from the President and from Congress. In official Washington today, the reaction has been much the same as anywhere else in the country. Shock and disbelief and sorrow. The president took the unprecedented step of postponing the State of the Union message, which he was due to give to Congress tonight. He will give it next week. He did go on television late this afternoon to comfort the nation. ABC Sam Donaldson at the White House.
The flag was lowered at the White House and other government buildings late this afternoon as President Reagan led the nation in mourning with a short address from the Oval Office.
Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss.
The day began with the president conferring with congressional leaders about his State of the Union message scheduled for delivery tonight. When he heard the news of the shuttle disaster, his first thought was to go ahead with it. You can't stop governing the nation, Mr. Reagan told a group of reporters. But as the president and his advisors kept watching the television replays of the explosion and the reactions of relatives, school children, and others, Mr. Reagan changed his mind.
The president thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred.
The State of the Union speech was put off until next Tuesday. Vice President Bush was dispatched to Cape Canaveral to express the president's concern to people there, and Mr. Reagan, in his own remarks, tried to explain to the school children who had watched the explosion, he said, why such things happen.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
This was to have been another night of triumph for the president, who had planned to tell the Congress and the nation how good things are in the country. But the shuttle disaster has changed all that. Officials here are shaken by the loss and by the fact that it's happened on Mr. Reagan's watch. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
This is Britt Hume. Officials usually keep emotions under control in Washington, but today there was no hiding them.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends.
It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
There were some calls to rein in NASA.
I think that some limit has to be placed on the PR that NASA indulges in.
I think the policy of sending civilians into space obviously had better be reevaluated.
But that seemed a minority sentiment.
Let us remember, in silent prayer, those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago.
Now their names become history. But that drive of the human spirit will not die. In that flash and fire, it will be reborn again, and other young men and young women who will read about them and learn.
Florida Congressman Nelson, who returned aboard the shuttle Columbia just last week, had lost none of his enthusiasm.
This is part of what you understand is part of the risk that you're taking. Of course I would go again, even if it were tomorrow.
I would go again tomorrow. If NASA would let me go, I would go again.
Unlike another costly and dangerous program, the military, the space program has always been popular here, seeming to represent something Americans like to think is theirs, the future. This tragedy may shake that feeling, but if today's reactions are a guide, not for long. Britt Hume, ABC News, on Capitol Hill.
Well, this tragedy has had repercussions well beyond the borders of the United States. When we come back. As ABC's Bill Blakemore now makes clear, there was shock and grief all across the country today and all around the world.
That poor teacher, you just think everything is just down pat, and then something like this happens. I feel awful.
The feeling that you get, that cold feeling all over, that only happens maybe 5 times in your lifetime.
Space shuttle explode, get it right now.
At midday, word flashed between people everywhere across the country.
Didn't you know that?
Yeah, the space shuttle blew up this morning.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's very tragic. I think it's the most tragic thing since the death of Kennedy himself.
And as with Kennedy's death, people remember where they were the moment they heard.
I think I was in an elevator in Midtown Manhattan, and somebody said the shuttle just came down.
But it was in those schoolrooms around the country.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Can we get the cameras?
Pilot,
Smith, Commander Dick Scobee, Judy Resnik, there it is. There you see.
The kids invited almost as if to a party for a live classroom lesson from space turned suddenly into a lesson in mortality.
You think that there's so much technology that, you know, they could keep things like this from happening.
I was horrified. I didn't think that would happen. I didn't think that would happen.
The shock was immediately felt around the world. Within 30 minutes of the explosion, Soviet TV showed it. In the Frankfurt airport, travelers stopped in their tracks. Back in America, test pilot Chuck Yeager showed the professionals' attitude to danger.
You don't give an awful lot of thought to it because, number one, you can't do anything about it when it happens.
But for most of us today, there was no professional detachment, just the sudden finality of it.
It was just a nice liftoff, and then right out the clear blue sky, boom, it happened, and it just made me feel bad.
Bill Blakemore, ABC News.
It made us all feel bad. We'll be back in a moment. It really was largely because of the teacher, Christa McAuliffe. We can't recall a time since man set foot on the moon when much of the nation, and because it was so many children, were engaged in a particular mission. When President Reagan went on television this afternoon, he was talking not only to the children, but to all of us, trying to comfort a nation.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Very often, but particularly today, this program seems inadequate to tell it all and to share it all. Later this evening on the full ABC network at 10 o'clock, 9 Central Time, we'll have a full hour special on today's tragedy, and then even later this evening on Nightline, Ted Koppel and his guests will go as deeply as one can on a day such as this into this tragedy. The death of 7 American astronauts and mourning across the land and around the world. That is our report on World News Tonight. I'm Peter Jennings. Good night.